Thank you all very much for coming along this morning. It's great to see so many of you in the room. I'm certainly looking forward to a lively Q&A session after our speakers have spoken to us. Ladies and gentlemen, this is we've been a long anticipated report, and there's been a lot of work that's gone into it. And I want to thank the authors, Andrew Laird and Justin Wilson in particular, for all of their hard work. And also I want to thank a gentleman in front of the room here, Mr. Philip Wrigley, a supporter of policy exchange. And Philip, without you this report wouldn't be in front of us today, so thank you very much indeed. I want to quickly run through just our panel behind us. We have a large panel today. I'll introduce them and they'll speak in turn after that. So first up we have Andrew Laird, author of the report, and Andrew's going to set out sort of the key recommendations behind it. Then we'll hear from Brian Lightman, General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders. And following Brian, we'll have Gabriel Salgren, who is the author of Schooling for Money, Swedish Education Reform and the Role of the Profit Movement. After Gabriel, we'll hear from Lisa Nandy. Lisa's Labour MP for Wigan and member of the Education Select Committee. And finally then we'll hear from Graham Stewart MP, who is Chairman of the Education Select Committee. So looking forward indeed to hearing what they have to say, and thank you all again for coming. I'll hand over to Andrew at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, James. I'm going to keep this very short and to give everybody else plenty of time for questions. So, first thing I would say about the report is that it isn't driven by ideology. It's driven by the fact that there is a perfect storm approaching our school system. Demand is going up, resources are going down, and something has to give in order for this challenge to be met. The statistics we're all familiar with, and if you're not, they're in the report. So the report seeks to look at whether allowing an element of profit-making provision within the school system can bring that additional investment, additional capacity that not only will allow the school system to meet basic need, but also to give parents and pupils an element of real choice. So one of the interesting things that came out of the report when we were identifying where our baseline was that we're actually further down the line here than probably many of us thought. If you look at areas like alternative provision, which includes PRUs and nursery provision, a lot of local authorities bring in outside providers who allow profit making to actually deliver those services. A couple of examples. Alternative provision in Northumberland is 50% delivered by companies which are allowed to make a profit. Nursery provision in Middlesbrough is almost 90% delivered by firms which are allowed to make a profit. So it begs the question, why is there such a cultural aversion to profit making, even an element of profit making, within the mainstream school system if our youngest and most vulnerable children are actually being serviced, in most cases very well, by the sector which allows an element of profit? We also looked internationally, and basically the international evidence shows that choice really works. Tony Blair accepted this back in 2005, Alan Milburn is still going on about it, the current coalition government completely accepts it. What the international evidence shows is that profits, allowing an element of profit making, helps create scale, but not just any sort of scale. Scale that's the right type of scale, and scale in the right areas. If you look at evidence from California, carried out by the Cato Institute, clearly shows that for non-profit making charter trusts, they're all expanding, but the good, the bad, the indifferent, they're all expanding. There is no performance-based expansion, whereas if you look at Sweden, where you have profit-making companies running schools, only the good expand, because that's the business model. Unless you get children to attend your school, have a good experience, want to come back, you don't have the money to expand. It's also true to point out that profit-making provision, or allowing an element of profit-making provision, fills a gap in the market. Any business model looks for gaps in the market. So in schooling, that is usually where there is poor school provision. It's usually in lower socioeconomic areas. And if you take the example of Edison education in America, 78% of pupils who attend their schools come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, so that bears out. So what do we propose? Well, we proposed a social enterprise model, which we think is a sensible middle ground. This isn't black and white. It's not just not-for-profit or for-profit. There is a spectrum of delivery, which is the realm of the social enterprise. So what we've actually proposed is a model where 50% of The surplus has to be reinvested into the school. 50% can be paid out to the shareholders. There are things like asset locks, increased financial freedoms, a very firm social purpose, but really importantly, employee ownership is a key point of this model. In other areas of public service, the government is encouraging public sector workers to take on ownership of services like nurses and social workers. Why not teachers? If you look at the evidence from the New Schools Network, a third of all inquiries to set up a free school come from teachers. Why not give them the opportunity to actually run the service? But we'll also need some extra safeguards in there as well to protect things like financial viability and performance. So that's all part of the model as well. So in short, great schools who are delivering a great job at the minute have nothing to fear from this extra choice, etc., that could come from allowing this type of model. But it will bring more investment and choice into the system. And I think at this point, that's a debate that absolutely has to happen, and I look forward to hearing what everybody else in the panel has to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, good morning everybody, and thanks very much for the invitation to come and respond to this report. Some of you might be thinking, well, Association of School and College Leaders, they represent the majority of secondary heads in the country, they're bound to be completely opposed to everything that it says in this report. And I'd like to make a rather more nuanced response to the report than simply saying something like that, because it's absolutely right that we need to analyse what we actually mean by the word profit and what the role of profit is in schools. I think there is a world of difference between talking about running schools for profit and talking about services to schools for profit and services that schools purchase. We've always supported local management of schools and greater autonomy to schools since it first came in, and it has given schools many, many opportunities to get better value for money and to purchase better services. And so virtually every school in the country, I guess, will be purchasing services from profit-making companies of one kind or another, and they will be going through a tendering process, and they will be looking to get the best possible value for money out of those services. And there's, in my book, there is absolutely nothing wrong with doing that, provided that they're getting the best value for money. There is one question that matters, nothing else matters as far as any discussion we have about education, and that is what is in the best interests of the learners in that school. If you can get the best value for money for the learners in that school, then obviously we've got to consider doing those things, and we've got to look at those. Now, I think in taking that particular debate forward, we then need to consider some of the sorts of things that we're doing. Andrew referred to something I wanted to pick up from the report, which was about these services that local authorities are franchising out, as it were, to alternative providers and SEN. I was a head for 16 years, and my school was adjacent to two special schools. And we had a major problem, the heads of those schools had a major problem with the drain of resources from a very, very hard-pushed LEA with very little funding to pay for incredibly expensive places outside the county for SEN, because there was no investment, no money to invest locally to actually provide that in the area. And that was a waste of public funds. It was costing thousands of pounds to go out. So it's not necessarily a good thing. I think there are some major issues there that need to be looked at. Similarly, I think we need to look at the difference between capital and revenue. Because if you look at the college sector, the FE college sector and the sixth form college sector, and we have members in those sectors as well, they have a lot more freedom to be creative and entrepreneurial in the way they actually develop their premises, and they are able to use those capital funds. And I think there's a bit of confusion in the report about building up surpluses to do that kinds of things, where we're talking about revenue money. The revenue money that comes into schools is about providing an education for those children who are in the school now. It is based on that principle, that's the way schools are funded. And the idea of building up a surplus is something actually where head teachers have had surpluses in governing bodies, they've come under great criticism, because and sometimes with justification, because they have not been spending the money that goes into their schools on those pupils. So I've absolutely got to refute the idea that a surplus should somehow be treated as a dividend and paid to people for profit. That is taxpayers' money that's there to educate the children, and I think that's something where we really have a problem in this. The other sort of assumptions that I'll briefly challenge, I'll try not to go on too much because we want to have a discussion about this. But, you know, there are numerous assumptions in the paper that, again, I would wish to discuss and challenge. I don't think that the way schools operate currently under local management, or indeed as academies, is inflexible in terms of the funding that they've got. I think they have enormous flexibilities. I think there's scope to look at how it can develop further. But I don't know whether profit, I don't think that a profit element would add any more flexibility to that. And the idea of being able to pay people less or go outside the paying conditions is certainly not something. We've got enough problems with a pay freeze and everything else that's going on, enough problems with recruitment and retention. The opening remarks here refer to the desperate need to make sure that we provide as many high quality places as we can within the system, and we need to have the highest quality of teachers and school leaders in our schools. And we've got to have a high status profession in order to do that. And at the moment, we are having great difficulties recruiting people of the calibre we need around the country. The report talks about more good schools. We believe that every school should be a good school. And we cannot be accepting a situation where we've got schools which are in a state of atrophy because another school has opened up and is pushing that school into the ground. That will take 4 or 5 years, during which time 4 or 5 generations of students will lose their life chances. I think that's absolutely immoral. We need to be building up the chances of every single pupil in the school. Now, I could say a great deal more at this stage, but I really, very aware of the time now. But just one word of caution as well, which I would like to just flag up at this stage. Please let's remember that we're talking about schools all over the country and not just in London. This is a very London-centric report, and the choice agenda is driven by a London perception. I grew up in London, I know all about London, but I've taught elsewhere, and we have members all over the country, and there are different challenges for schools in rural Lincolnshire or Cumbria or other cities around the country than there are in London. And I think there's a danger that we end up thinking about a nationwide solution to problems that are more pressing issues in London. Thanks very much.
Yes, thanks for letting me come here today and talk about these important issues. Well, I belong to those who argue that for-profit schools are key for any policy aiming to instill more choice and competition in the education sector. And I therefore been claiming, and I continue to claim, that the UK ban should be removed. Why is the profit motive important? Well, we've heard a great deal from Andrew here. I agree entirely with the report. First of all, it gives incentives to grow and capitalize on scale economies, incentives which non-profit organizations generally do not have. And when they do have those incentives, it's generally much more difficult for them to raise the necessary funds because they cannot target investors, get the funding in exchange for potential future profit. And when they do grow, it depends on philanthropy. And there are little incentives for philanthropists to back the best schools, precisely as the evidence from California shows. And finally, I would say that non-profit schools tend to be set up in middle-class neighborhoods by middle-class parents, and they therefore cater primarily to middle-class pupils. This should contrast with the for-profit company who tend to set up shop wherever there's a good business opportunity. In order to produce an education market in the UK, I argue that we need a supply-side dynamic that gives parents more than a theoretical right to choose schools, which is currently the case today. And that supply-side dynamic requires for-profit actors. Does the profit motive drive down quality? The short answer, although it's much more complicated, is no. On the whole, research from Sweden, America, and Chile display either positive or null effects compared to public or non-profit schools. There's one study from Sweden that shows a tiny minor negative effect in the Swedish upper secondary school sector. I argue that the estimation strategy is flawed because when you compare upper secondary school grades and GPA specifically in Sweden, they're not comparable because pupils tend to study completely different subjects. So I also think, however, that Chilean evidence is very important in this. I couldn't find anything about that in the report. Chile is the second country after Sweden who allows for-profit companies to participate in a universal voucher scheme. And as in Sweden, many people have been arguing that these companies tend to produce more segregation than better quality of education. Is that true? No. The best evidence, again, the most recent research shows that for-profit schools that do not charge top-up fees tend to enroll more disadvantaged pupils than comparable public and non-profit schools. When it comes to performance, we have again recent studies showing that specifically for-profit chain schools, the schools, the for-profit companies that scale up, perform better than most non-profit schools and on par with the best Catholic schools. So while there are many problems in the Chilean education system, very little suggests that profits are to blame for that. So what about the social enterprise model here? Well, I argue it's a step forward, but it's not the best policy option available. A duty to reinvest a portion of the profits would make it more difficult to attract investors to support new schools or expansion of existing schools, simply because it means much higher risk taking. And I think the profit margins in this sector is about 5 to 10%. It's supposed to be a very risk-free sector, but if we achieve this kind of supply-side dynamic, which I'm talking about, there's going to be much more risk involved because schools will actually fail. So the corollary is that the sought-after supply-side flexibility that I just mentioned might not materialize, or at least be significantly diluted, and I don't think we should take that risk. And I also wonder, I understand this is a political solution to a political problem, and I wonder whether critics of profits would be satisfied. Because it's not like they're arguing that 50 or 40 or 60%, whatever that might be, can go to the rapacious capitalists in tax haven somewhere. That's not what they're arguing. They're arguing that not one single penny should be going to dividends. Everything should be reinvested. So I'm just wondering if it's actually a politically possible solution. Are there no dangers when allowing for-profit schools? There certainly are, and I want to be clear on that. The evidence from around the world displays that while it's relatively easy to make schools compete, it's more difficult to make them compete along the lines of quality. In Sweden, which often is upheld as a good case, and for many reasons, but the significant problem is that we combine decentralized grading with teachers set to grade with heavily centralized admission systems, which have led to perverse incentives among parents and pupils to seek out the best schools, or the schools and the teachers that set the highest grades for the least efforts. The upshot is that if schools are given opportunities to compete by other means than quality, they are likely to do so because it's expensive to compete by quality. And it's therefore crucial that when we allow commercial interests into the education sector, that we promote a healthy incentive framework, we harness the incentives, and we basically channel them towards increasing quality specifically. And in conclusion, I would concur with Eric Hanushek, who's one of the foremost education economists in the world, that the key problem in today's education system is that there are no incentives to improve pupil performance. For-profit schools are clearly not sufficient to improve the incentive structure. Other complementary reforms are much necessary, and I discuss these in detail in an upcoming paper for the Institute of Directors. Instead, I argue that for-profit schools are but one important element in a coherent reform package designed to transform the current education sector into a functioning education market. I am certainly aware of the political difficulties involved in allowing these commercial enterprises to participate in a publicly funded education sector. However, if there's anything that 30 years of school choice research has shown, it is that half-hearted measures, half-hearted reforms are not likely to generate more than meager gains. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I wanted to start by acknowledging that private providers can, and for-profit providers can, of course, set up and run successful schools, and this report sets out a number of examples where that has happened, and I think that it would be wrong to start this debate by saying that any one organisation or institutional structure has a monopoly on running successful education programmes. We know there are examples of cooperatives, of charities, of parent groups, of teacher groups, of state involvement, of for-profit and not-for-profit involvement in the education system that produce very good outcomes for children. And when I was preparing for today's event, one of the things that somebody said to me was, we seem to spend an awful lot of time in this country, about 80% of our time discussing standards and discussing structures, and about 20% of the time discussing what happens in the classroom, when actually we know that 80% of the impact that is made on children is about what happens in the classroom. and only about 20% can really be accounted for by the structure that we use. And I think that that is a good lesson for all of us on the platform, and perhaps something to reflect on as we have this debate. And I think that in the UK the question is not so much about whether for-profits or not-for-profits run schools, but actually about the extent to which we allow for-profit involvement in education. As the report points out, there is already involvement in education of for-profit companies, some successful, some not so successful, and in a variety of different ways. And I would start by saying that I think that we need to be cautious about the extent to which we allow for-profit providers to get involved in mainstream education in the way in which the report suggests. And I would say this for a number of reasons. Firstly, because I believe that education is a public good. And because it's a public good, I think that leads you to a number of conclusions. One is that I think we have to be very careful actually about the message that we send to children. At the moment, education is highly regarded as something that we invest in and of itself, because it is important to us that all of our children in this country are highly educated and have the best chance in life. And this matters to us as a society, not just because we can make a profit out of it, not just because we can show that we can do it well, but because those children matter to us and matter to us equally. I also think that as somebody who's been a school governor for 10 years now, a member of the Education Select Committee, I spend an awful lot of time both with teachers and with children. I've worked with some of the most disadvantaged children in this country over the last 10 years, that I think that public service ethos that you have in schools is invaluable. And I wanted to just challenge one of the assumptions that seems to underpin this report, that actually that people who are involved in the education in this system in this country need a profit motive in order to drive improved standards and replicate success. Because actually I've seen for myself over the last decade many examples of where people have been inspired to do that for completely opposite reasons to that. And I have never met a teacher who goes to work inspired by pay. I think if there are any teachers in the room, they'll probably tell you why and at length. But the thing that really makes teachers tick, and when you really see them come alive and love their job, is because they've made a connection with a child who previously nobody could reach, and they've made that connection based on their experience. They've made that connection based on using their own professional skills and judgments. And I've been critical both of my party when we're in government and of the current government for not allowing teachers to use their professional skills and judgment enough, because I think that really is the thing that motivates people to drive up standards and improve outcomes, particularly for the most vulnerable children. I also think that there will be times when the needs of children and profit margins come into conflict. And I think that's another reason why we need to be incredibly cautious. And actually I think that this report recognises that, because the structure that has been recommended, partly for political reasons, but I think also partly because of the risks involved in allowing for-profits to take a large role in the education sector, the structure that's been recommended is quite complicated. And I think that's because there are particular risks for some children, because some children won't necessarily be as profitable as others. I think there are real inherent dangers in treating parents and children as consumers, because inevitably what that does is set up that people with purchasing power, greater purchasing power, have a bigger impact in the way that the system is shaped. And I also think that you need safeguards in place to make sure that there are limits to the extent to which the curriculum can be influenced for commercial gain. And I would say this, that I think that one of the real imperatives for politicians in trying to shape an education system is trying to ensure that there is public trust and confidence in that system. And when we see public trust and confidence break down, that's where we have real problems. And what concerns me as well about allowing for-profit providers to operate to a large extent in the system is that there isn't a level of public support for that, and there is inevitably a level of suspicion about what the impact of that would be. I wanted to just challenge Gabriel on some of the things that he said, because I think, having looked at the evidence from across the world where for-profit providers operate, including in his report. I think that the evidence is at best mixed, that for-profit provision and in fact greater competition raises standards. In Philadelphia, for example, although there was a significantly raised impact of for-profit providers, one of the key features of that system was that the for-profit providers had much greater experience in running education systems than the not-for-profit providers. In Michigan and Florida, studies have found that there was little or no difference in introducing for-profits to the system, and in Chile there was a small difference, but it was only a small difference once you control for income and educational background of the parents involved. And one of the things I wanted to say is that none of the studies seem to have been able to control for the fact that actually there are very few countries in the world where the state doesn't provide the majority of education. And once you take into account that therefore parents who choose to send their children to schools that are run by alternative providers may have a stronger interest in their children's education, it's incredibly difficult to know whether that's had any impact or not, and I've not seen a study yet which actually controls for that. I think we also have to be careful about saying, has the introduction of for-profits or greater competition had an impact on the children in the school, because you also have to look very carefully at what happens to the children in other schools as a consequence of introducing those reforms. And also, I think that this is an incredibly complicated area. Of course, there are many cultural and other factors which are very difficult to control for. There are other reforms taking place at the same time, and I also think it's very difficult because what schools do is incredibly complex. Actually, we don't just expect our schools to produce narrow academic results. We expect our schools to produce young people who are ready for life and not just for work. And so there are a whole range of factors you have to take into account, and the studies are limited on that. I think instead what we ought to do is look very closely at what works, because there is very strong evidence from across the world about what works in schools, and there are successful countries who consistently top the league tables. Finland is an example of that, and Graham and I recently visited Finland together as part of a select committee delegation, where greater competition and the introduction of for-profits is not part of their agenda. And in fact, they urged us to come away very strongly with the idea that raising the status of teaching, teacher pay, but actually more importantly, they said teaching working conditions is the key factor in raising achievement. And in fact, they said to us that one of the key things about Finland is, of course, apart from in the capital, it's very difficult for parents to exercise choice. They tend to send their children to the local school rather than have them travel hundreds of miles, often across a forest, in order to get to another school. And so they focus very much on raising the achievement of children in every school and making sure that local schools are good schools. We also know that strong accountability combined with strong autonomy over what and how things are taught in the classroom is a critical factor in success. We know that from a number of studies, including the OECD studies. And I think that what we ought to be focusing on, rather than talking about a debate where we know that there are potentially some positive impacts, potentially some negative impacts, we're not sure whether it will work, and we need to construct quite a complicated system in order to mitigate for the risks. Instead, I think we ought to be focusing very much on how we allow teachers to use their professional skills and judgment in the classroom, how we construct very intelligent accountability measures. And I think we've really struggled with that in this country. The introduction of the EBAC, I think, has not helped very much. Those are the things that I think that we ought to be focusing on if we are genuine about trying to improve standards in our schools for all children. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure to go last and to follow my colleague on the select committee. And if we go through the contributions we've had, the author of the report quite rightly said, what is it we're looking for? Why would we consider having for-profit companies allowed to run schools? And it seems to me there's two basic reasons. One is to increase capacity, so bringing in capital that we otherwise wouldn't have, and the other is to bring in additional expertise and through the capacity challenge and raise quality. That's basically why we would do it. And a lot of the report focuses on the capacity element. And that presupposes that we've got the perfect storm, as it's described, of increasing demand, 500,000 more primary places required in London, for instance, and limited public resource. And the 60% cut in the capital spend of the department over the peak year at the end of the Labour period is used to show how terribly parlous is our capital situation. I'm not sure that that's entirely correct. This government will be spending more on capital in each year than the Blair government did in its first 2 terms on average. The Building Schools for the Future programme, as we know, had serious flaws, and there is now, following the James report, delivering more places at lower cost. And in an overall political situation, we privatised water because we'd never get the capital investment in the water system against schools and hospitals. I don't think that's necessarily the case in education. So if you're looking at purely from a capacity point of view, can the state and can our political situation deliver sufficient capital to provide the places required without turning to the private sector? And I think the answer is probably yes. And we don't need a repeat of the PFI, where we basically have the lowest cost borrower in the system. We pay someone who borrows money more expensively than we can, with a complex set of legally created and consultant-created contracts put in place in order to allow us to do it. So I'm not sure that I buy the capital. I would do it. I'm quite happy to go to the private sector where I don't think the state will spend the money, but I think the state will provide school places. So personally, I don't see a huge benefit just in terms of capacity. If we want choice in a system, which is a different matter, then the state must not only will it, but make it happen and provide the means to make it happen. We have to create surplus places in order to exercise choice. Do we have to do that through the private sector? Personally, I don't see it as obvious that that is the way to go. Looking at the contributions, Brian talked about a nuanced response. Of course, he's a union leader from the leaders, so it's important that Brian always sound nuanced. But I thought by the end of his piece, if I'm not, he sounded as if there was a pretty strong ideological opposition. The idea that surpluses should never go in profit, he seemed to think per se was wrong, despite saying that the most important thing was the quality of education. That is the most important thing. I wish we didn't have free market ideologues on one hand and, however they dress it up, anti-free market ideologues on the other, conducting this debate. It's all about, can we improve the quality of education for our young people? And as I think Lisa rightly said, when you look across the world, the evidence is mixed. You know, we've run schools for an awfully long time, and they've been for-profit schools for an awfully long time. If they were absolutely clearly superior to state-run schools, you'd have thought they might just about have managed to push their wedge forward more effectively than they have. In truth, it's mixed. And why is that? Is that because for-profit is terrible and the public will never accept it that people make a profit out of education? Clearly not true, as it's said in the report. So many profit, huge component of our education system, including schools, albeit not their management, are already run for profit. The point is, can you construct a set of incentives, where I think Lisa was spot on in her contribution, can you get a set of incentives that gets the behaviour you want, that raises standards in the classroom and harnesses what the private sector can bring? And I think the jury is still out on that. Certainly the evidence from Sweden, the USA, Chile, none of these places are making anyone want to rush to mimic their systems. They're certainly not the top performing systems in PISA. And if you go to Finland, you go to Singapore, you go to Korea, what you don't see is a major for-profit sector transforming educational standards. So as you can tell, I have neither a clear position on one side of it. It seems to me, though, that the Policy Exchange report says that what we should do is we should do pilots. We should see how we can get the for-profit management of schools targeting the poorest. And Lisa made a point, and I think it's a fair one, that some children are more profitable than others. And if you set the incentive structures up in the wrong way, then what you could have is the more advantaged children get further advantage out of a profit-run system. But it doesn't have to be that way. And with the pupil premium, you know, whose effectiveness we'll see over time. But if the pupil premium were used to mean that the poorest children, those who are most often left behind, are in fact targeted by the for-profit sector. And that's where it goes, where we could combine social justice by getting the for-profit sector to add capacity in a particular area with high levels of deprivation. Bringing capacity in there, raise standards, and do so in a way which can carry public support, because that's the other point, of course. Populous recently did a survey showing that I think it was 79% of people were concerned about schools being run by for-profit organisations. I think as politicians we take notice of that sort of thing because we like to get re-elected. But if we would, a lot of that public concern will be based on a fear that it will mean diminution of quality for their children, or indeed an increase in unfairness. If we can get over that, if we could allow the profits, if we can have social enterprise models, which I suppose, what you could say is it's rather a timid proposal in the Policy Exchange report. It's either one thing or the other. It's a sort of for-profit but dressed up as social enterprise with 50-50. It does all sound a bit of a fudge. On the other hand, it's recognising the public misgivings and trying to find a way of, in our context, of allowing for-profit management to come in, see if it can tackle, if it goes into areas, as Policy Exchange suggests, areas with a high level of children entitled to free school meals, then conceivably, I don't think it's going to play a revolutionary part in our education system, but what we could do is we could see whether it can deliver improved outcomes and better social justice for the poorest children. And certainly politically, I debated with Mary Bousted on Newsnight a couple of nights ago, where she was opposing it in principle, even where it's targeted at the poorest, and on a pilot basis to see if it can raise standards. I don't think those on the left really want to find themselves in that position of opposing piloted proposals targeted on the poorest with the aim of raising standards. And I think we should consider moving forward on a cautious basis to conduct just the sort of pilots which Policy Exchange suggests. Fundamentally, though, it's all about teaching. I mean, McKinsey said in their report you can't have a system that's better than the quality of teaching within it. If you look across the world, you go to Singapore with one type of system, you go to Finland, an entirely different kind of system. It's about attracting the best people into teaching and then getting the best out of them. And a question that we don't seem to hear a great deal of in this is, what is it about the for-profit sector that will make teaching more attractive to higher caliber candidates so that we can move to where Finland are with 10 people applying for each job? And what is it about the for-profit management that will make those people, will raise the standards of teaching that they're then able to deliver on a consistent basis and want to stay in teaching, helping our kids? If it's all about teaching, then those are the questions we need to ask. And it's not obvious at the moment in what way the for-profit sector can deliver on that. And I tend, actually, without the ideological opposition to for-profit, I tend to think that the priorities which Lisa itemised at the end of her address are probably the right ones and where we ought to focus more of our time.
Well, thank you all very much, and a variety of opinions, and well put by all. I'd like to go over to this point at questions. We have a roving mic in the room, so perhaps I could take a couple of questions to start with. If you could please say who you are, where you're from, and if relevant, who your question is directed towards. So there's a gentleman at the back of the room.
Rick Muir from IPPR. I mean, I don't disagree with the need for reform in the school system to improve standards. I mean, there are so many points which I could come back on here. I'd be here all day, but I'm not going to do that. I just want to, one point that hasn't been addressed in the criticism of the report, I think, is where it talks about the existing use of private providers in other sectors. Although nowhere in the report does it say whether or not those providers are actually doing a good job or not, which is probably one of the most important questions we should ask. And specifically in terms of early years education, all public services are the legacy of a series of historical compromises between political parties and so on. So why do we have lots of private providers in early years? Because the state never provided proper early years education, so the private in the voluntary sector were there to provide those cases. It doesn't mean it's right. I mean, that's a separate question. Actually, if you look at Sweden and other countries which have much better early years provision than we do, it's generally provided by the state and not by the private sector. And in part, the quality of those early years providers is because they pay better qualified staff more, you know, and rather than less is posited in here. So I think we have to be very clear. Just because the private sector operates in particular areas, you know, you can't just say that's right independently of an assessment of whether or not it works.
Thank you. Lady behind.
Hi, my name is Adele Eastman. I'm a Senior Policy Specialist at the Centre for Social Justice, and I'd like to just pick up on that. We wrote a report, the author of it, we published it in September, No Excuses, a review of educational exclusion. So a lot of the children that we focus on in the report are very relevant to your report. And it's really in relation to alternative education provision that I'd also like to pick up on that point. That is a largely unregulated sector, and there is no quality assurance, and there are huge concerns at the moment over the quality of education and pastoral care provided to society's most vulnerable children within that sector. One anonymous witness, who happens to be a head, told us that we've literally scratched the surface of a modern day scandal. I was also in receipt of evidence that there's one local authority spending millions on alternative education provision, despite having huge concerns with it, and we list a number of those in our report. So I think that real caution needs to be exercised in relation to referencing them as a potential good reason for adopting the approach that you suggest. The statistics, whilst they may look impressive on the face of it, there is a serious concern in terms of the reality going on the ground in relation to services being provided. Also, I think there's another elephant in the room in terms of the targets and pressures on teachers and schools and heads in terms of what they're required to meet attendance and attainment targets and the school performance league tables. There are already a few problems in terms of unscrupulous practices and illegal activity in some of our schools in this country in relation to backdoor exclusions in particular, and we already have that practice going on in some schools. If you introduce a financial incentive on top of that, and in the context of some of the most marginalised parents in our country more unlikely to engage in terms of wanting to be shareholders of this proposed schools being set up, and I think that there's a real risk there in creating perhaps perverse incentive inadvertently. So I just put those points to the panel in terms of whoever may really want to pick up on those.
Thank you, thank you. Let's turn to the panel line. Andrew, do you want to respond to any of those points initially?
Sure, yeah. All right, it's obviously working. Just on the second question there, or sorry, the first question actually from Rick about why the report doesn't spend longer talking about whether for-profit provision in other parts of the public sector are working. I mean, the report was structured in a way that the first challenge was to dispel the myth that sometimes exists when you talk to people, and it actually is true, particularly in the education establishment, that this doesn't happen and this hasn't happened. So it was just really to show that it does happen, and it briefly touched on other parts of public services, but actually the focus of the report is on looking at the USA and looking at Sweden and seeing what the benefits of that type of provision are. And the report doesn't make the blunt argument that for-profit provision is better than voluntary or state provision. What it does argue is that the presence of an element of that within the system builds capacity, creates choice, and as Tony Blair was arguing back in 2005, that improves all services, whether you're state-run, voluntary or private sector run, that availability of choice improves it. And on the second point, I agree, it's a very good point.
Gabriel, do you want to come in at any points particularly on the quality issue and the dangers of for-profit on that?
Well, yes, I could. On the quality issue, like you said, it's mixed, but it's not mixed that there is any evidence that for-profit schools would drive down quality. And again, if we're interested in increasing choice and competition, creating the scale, then we need a for-profit motive. Next comment from the IPPR. I would just say that this is specifically the reason why we would need competition. Competition, if you look at Martin West, Ludwig Westman's research, which is basically analyzing PISA scores using a very robust estimation strategy, they find very, very strong positive effects of private school competition when you use the cross-national data. So it's not the second. I mean, Finland is good, Singapore is good. We know that Asian pupils do well in America as well. They do much better. We know that Asian pupils do better here. So there seems to be something else going on there, and you can't really replicate that. My argument anyway is that if you can target incentives which tend to work elsewhere in the economy towards improving quality, I think we should do that. It's very, very important though that you have a strict accountability framework, and I think that's the key. And I think you shouldn't allow more for-profit schools before you, for example, tackle the great inflation that you have in this country. By reforming the system in that way. And many other things. I would say the pupil premium is a great idea, but it's not enough. Because if you create the system, it's much more expensive to educate a poor or a low-performing child than a rich and a high-performing child, right? So if you don't have systematic differentiation, but it also depends on prior ability. You should also differentiate the funding based on prior ability. Then you might have a situation where the for-profit schools start competing along the lines of seeking out the best students or the richest or the highest performing ones. So it's very important that you see this as a coherent reform package. It's not one single policy. That's what I'm arguing for. I'm not arguing for that for-profit schools are the panacea for everything. So that's.
Thank you, Brian. Do you want to quickly comment?
I mean, I think actually that last point is just so important. At the moment we've got so many different policies flying around, and actually putting that jigsaw together is a massive issue. But I mentioned about the SEN provision, and I think the alternative provision is an absolutely valid point. It's a surprising example to have been chosen there, because it is an absolutely massive problem, and we know. All over the country, ask heads all over the country, and they will tell you all about the problems. That's why Charlie Taylor, the behaviour advisor for the government, is about to produce a report, which we're looking forward to seeing. It is an area that really has to be addressed with. But I think the other point is, who runs schools? Obviously I'm going to argue that head teachers run schools, companies don't run schools, these outside people don't run schools. And I think we need to think about what we're actually talking about here when we're looking at providers and what we're talking about there. And Lisa's points here about raising the status of the teaching profession and so on. We are at the moment in a completely polarised situation where we are unable to have a rational discussion about what actually raises standards because we're in receipt of a non-stop tirade about what's wrong. And I think that is the major problem at the moment. We are here to actually raise standards in schools, and I think we need a balanced debate about what actually does that.
Thank you. Let's turn to some more questions in the room. So we'll have one here and the two ladies over at the side. Thank you. Just keep it brief and say who
we switched on. Yeah. Very briefly, I'm David Jones, I'm chairman of the New Model School Company, and I was very interested in your study of Chilean and Swedish schools. We are a British chain of schools, established for the reason that we thought there was going to be a lot of debate about schools in Britain, and the great thing was just to get on and do it. So we provide excellent education at a price lower than the government can provide, to prove that excellent education can be made affordable to everyone. We have not been visited by any of the panellists in their surveys about what should be done. We are not for profit, we're not for loss, but we do pay rent. If any of you would actually like to see how it can be done, and I listen to you as a practitioner, please come and see. Would you like to come and see us? That's my question. Would you actually like to know?
Love to.
I think that was one of the five saying yes?
I said yes.
Sorry,
formal delegation.
Two ladies at the side, please.
Hi, I'm Kerry Ahern from Ambitious Adult Autism. We hear a lot about good schools. I'm just wondering if the panel believes that there is a consensus in education about what constitutes a good school. Because people talk about it, and I think there's everyone assumes we all know what it means. I mean, I'm struggling with the concept myself, but I'd just like to hear what people's views are. And if we continue in policy to talk about good schools, how do we define that? And also, how do we measure it and when do we measure it?
Hi, I'm Rachel Jones. My background is in headship and inspection in schools, particularly in challenging circumstances. I'm currently doing a piece of work with a new multi-academy trust set up to meet the needs of primary schools in particular. And our experience as a non-profit organisation over the last 6 months has been to witness what I can only describe as cherry picking. And it really concerns me in the context of this report that there's a substantial risk that for-profit providers of particular services, or even in terms of running a series of schools, will pick off some of the more profitable and easier to service schools. And I take the point about London-centric because we particularly found difficulty in how much it costs us as an organisation to go and service the needs of, particularly very small schools, rural schools, and scattered schools. So to have a coherent approach to this, one has to look at what it would mean ultimately if the entire system were for-profit, because otherwise I think we face a risk that the for-profit sector will hive off that section, and it will be the public sector that sweeps up the however many percent it is that remain and actually are more expensive to run.
Thank you. Graham, do you want to pick up on the second question there about what we actually mean by a good school, what we nationally think of?
Well, and how and when do we measure it? I mean, obviously we've got in secondary schools the key measurement is the 5 good GCSEs, which has a tiny contextual element based on you've got to both to be picked up by if you fail to get to the currently 35% 5 good GCSEs, then you can avoid intervention if you have above average progress in the children in that cohort, which turns out 111 schools, I think it is, this year didn't meet the benchmark, and 4 of those had above average progress. So effectively, if you don't meet the benchmark, because children with low prior attainment make, on average, lower than average progress thereafter, this supposed amelioration doesn't really ameliorate much. In secondary schools, heads are driven by meeting that benchmark, and that is regardless, effectively, of the prior attainment. So you are creating, and if that is the sole metric, other than Ofsted coming in, that drives your behaviour, then you will seek to meet that target, because who wants, after 25 years in education, to be branded a failure, and the family and community told that they're running a bad school? Well, I wouldn't. So you would create huge incentives by having that particular benchmark which drives behaviour. And you then have Ofsted who come in as well. If you can get to be outstanding, of course, you can go a number of years without being visited by them. Ofsted are sharpening up what they're looking at. They're now saying, I think Sir Michael Wilshaw is right, you can't be a good school if you don't have, you can't be an outstanding school if you don't have outstanding teaching, which seems common sense and shows the rather bureaucratic process we had before that allowed it. But going back to Gabriel's point earlier, we haven't found a framework that creates the right incentives in the system we've already got. And we have enormous perverse incentives created, effectively selection through the back door. Well, if I was the head teacher of a school in an area with children for whom it was going to be tough to get them to that benchmark, you're going to be tempted to try and find ways to filter the children who come in. You're going to exclude them. You're going to certainly get them not to be there when Ofsted visit. There's so many perverse incentives. If we put for profit into this world in which, after all these years, we haven't managed to create the right framework that delivers what we actually want. And we haven't even got the right framework just looking at exams, and yet we've got a system which is over-focused on exams. We're trying to provide children with a rounded education, and not just a rounded education for the future. We're trying to give them a good day today. And our current incentives don't do that. You throw for profit in, and whatever you ask for profits, we'll try to deliver what it is you say you want. Because they'll only, teachers, at least, they make a profit, they get paid, whatever happens. For-profit companies only make money if they succeed. And what does success mean? Not what we might think it might mean, it'll mean whatever it is the government says it is. And if that means delivering kids to a certain level, they'll try and find kids, the first thing they'll do is try and find kids who they think will get to that level. Can't blame them. And they will do exactly what Gabriel was talking about, they will look for poor kids, and then they'll look to get all Asian ones if they think the Asian kids are going to be the ones who pass the exams. And if they think white working class boys are not very good, they'll come up with a construct which just quietly doesn't suit white working class boys, because you know how hard it is. So that's, before you get into any of the kind of ideology, you've got this big issue of, can we create a framework the way that you can for supermarkets in education, so that actually the incentives are aligned with policy goals? And that's the single biggest question we've got. I don't think we entirely know how to do that yet, and that's why we have to be cautious, even if we were very much a free market Tory. I generally believe in it, believe in competition, I believe in choice. But you better work out beware what you wish for if you don't know exactly what that is and you don't know how to construct incentives to deliver it.
Lisa, you're nodding. Is a complete agreement on this?
I'm finding this really unnerving. I've never agreed with Graham before in my life. We are in complete unison. I mean, I would certainly echo that point about, you know, how do you construct a system without perverse incentives, and this question about what makes a good school. I mean, I would say broadly that it's an institution that equips children for life as well as for the workforce, gives them a good day-to-day experience and has a strong focus on their individual personal needs, so that every child is able to reach their full potential and not just to meet a benchmark. But I think you've got to ask, you know, what makes a good school and for whom. And what really concerns me is the children who become invisible when purchasing power is the imperative. I used to work in the voluntary sector. I worked for two very different organisations, one of which, Centrepoint, the Youth Homeless Charity, had a number of contracts, and still does, I think, with both local, central government and with other organisations. One of the things that we always really struggled with is the fact that those contracts were usually framed in terms of tangible outcomes. Well, actually, for a lot of the young people we worked with, actually getting up and eating breakfast in the morning was a 6-month programme and constituted real progress. But it wasn't the sort of outcome that funders were necessarily looking for. And what really concerns me when I see, for example, in the prison system, that we're now trying to construct contracts in order to get young people who are leaving those institutions into work, is that is an incredibly blunt instrument. It's very hard to demonstrate progress. What it does is it encourages people to cherry pick, in the words of one of the people in the audience, to cream off those young people who are already almost there, to leave behind the ones who probably most need the intervention and help. Because Centrepoint was a charitable organisation with a strong social justice mission, we just picked those young people anyway and focused on them anyway. What worries me is that if the model is profit and the incentive is profit, what motivation is there to do that for those young people? And if I could just briefly disagree with Graham on one thing, it's this...
it's not just your credibility at stake.
I'm not sure that anyone's really challenged this idea that surplus places is necessarily a good thing. And I just wanted to take that on because obviously profit in the system and competition are not exactly the same thing, but the report relies on both, and it completely ignores the reality of children's experiences of education, that where the area that I represent, firstly, because of transport and travel costs, it's just simply not viable to go to another school. There isn't the space to set up another school in many of my local areas. Children make friends, they don't move for a whole host of reasons. They have siblings at that school, they might be doing exams. And what really concerns me about this idea that you create surplus places, you allow the so-called good schools to flourish, and you allow others, in Michael Gove's words, to wither and die, is that takes time. And what happens to the children in those institutions while that school is withering and dying? I think we need to be really careful about just assuming that somehow this model of surplus places, which in fact is also incredibly expensive, is necessarily a good thing.
Thank you. The audience, please. Let's see, with Briar and then Daniel at the back, and then the lady in the back room.
Briar Lipson. Graham rubbished the need for the kind of polarised ideological debate and asked a number of questions about how profit can really help in the classroom. Well, and I'm sure a bunch of other people in the room have ideas, and we wouldn't necessarily agree on them, and there are all kinds of endless debates that go on about class size and school size and whether you should have teachers or technology. And I would argue that there actually aren't answers, and that there are 1,000 solutions and not just one. Brian and Lisa talked about lots of their solutions, which were things like raising the status of teaching and other things that I would argue are motherhood and apple pie. Everyone agrees we need to raise the status, but I didn't hear any solutions about how you would actually go about achieving that. There'll be people in the room alongside me who think the solution is to let the profit sector have a go. And so my question would be very, very clearly, why not? Why not let the people who think profit will make a difference have a go and see what happens? And I think the only person that actually addressed that and answered that was Brian when he said that taxpayers' money should not go toward making profit, it's for pupils. And I think that is the crux of this debate, but we're not really talking about it.
Thank you. Daniel.
So I haven't read the full report yet, so I'm just about a quarter of the way through it. But the bit I haven't got to yet is really thinking about the commissioning environment, whereby if you took your idea of the social enterprise schools, where do they fit into in terms of the wider system, in terms of how would you convert existing schools? Would it be the closure and reopening? And what are the metrics over time to track whether those schools, when they set up as for-profit companies, are they going to be in a multi-academy trust sort of model? Do you anticipate that being the logical development? That, if you have these individual schools where teachers were part investors in it, would they naturally federate over time? And what in that environment, I think that's a broader question, what's the middle tier of accountability going to be in a new system like this? Do we need something more than Ofsted in terms of looking at the economic reality of managing schools in the state sector? Because they don't really do that particularly well at the moment. And I just think the other aspect is what's the role of central government in this commissioning environment where you've got profit schools? I'd just be interested to hear the practicalities, and also just lastly, whether there will be people here today who have got a notional interest in running this, but given the very strong political currents in this country of opposition within certainly the education workforce, a number of people to the idea of for-profit schools, whether it's worth the media risk of actually directly running these schools on a long-term basis, on a scalable basis, is a question that's really open to it. I mean, I'm not against competition at all, far from it, but I do think that it's a very difficult proposition to take forward with the money in the public capital.
Thank you, and lady in the room at the back.
Henrietta Royal. I was a governor of an inner city primary school in London for 15 years, and I just stepped down as the COO of City University. What concerns me is that we have been talking about this for a long time. There seems to be a tendency of, we must have one size fits all. It must cover the entire country, whatever we do. Well, why? Secondly, if we do X, then there will be some children that may not benefit from it or may be disadvantaged by it. Whatever you do, we are failing those children now. We are failing a lot of other children alongside them because we're not prepared to actually confront the problem. That there are some children who need perhaps more money spent on them and to be taught in a different environment because of the backgrounds they come from or the difficulties they have. And therefore, actually, why not think about accepting that we do try some other models, that the government accepts that it has to maybe put some more money into areas where, or children, as it's been suggested, that may have more challenges. So you don't just maybe pay on the basis of they got more background, but also if they come out of primary school well below where they should be, if they attract an extra pupil premium on top of that, perhaps. Or they've got behavioural issues. There are a number of different things you can do. But to simply say, because we can't get it perfect in the new world, we'll stay with what everybody accepts as a deeply imperfect world now, that's better. And somehow, magically, we're going to get these, every school should be a good school. Of course they should be. But you're not going to come up with any ideas about how you change that. We've been trying to do that for years. Let's try something new.
Thank you. Brian, you want to respond to that last point?
And the first one, really, you know, because I think it's absolutely crucial. I was just reminded, just listening there, of a phrase that the Welsh Education Minister likes to use a lot, Leighton Andrews, when he refers to England as a laboratory, where you can, you know, he loves to look over to England and learn from the mistakes that are made in the experiments in England. Now, you know, I mean, the question is, are we a laboratory where we just try out new things all of the time? Or are we actually, you know, is there actually a situation? We're talking about the problems here, but at the same time, there is a vast amount of good practice. We know what works in many of the schools around the country. There are people in this room looking around the audience I know who are associated with some highly successful schools. Why aren't we looking at that best practice and sharing that? And that is the answer to raising the status of the profession, together with getting away from what I referred to before, this culture where we criticize everything and we don't engage with the profession. We don't allow the profession to engage over what the best practice is. Now, if you know, a profit-making model, if I could be convinced that a profit-making model was the answer to these things, you know, and I could see some good practice somewhere, then I'd love to consider it. But at the moment, I can look a lot closer to home and a lot of really good examples of things that we can take, and we can raise the status of the profession and stop rubbishing them and actually talk about what works well and encourage that best practice to be spread. I'm very worried about the development of just a free-for-all where any new idea is better than what already exists. And I think that's my biggest concern.
Thanks, Andrew. Do you want to come in maybe on some of Daniel's comments?
Sure. I mean, just quickly on Briar's point first. I mean, your question about you know, any surplus or anything that should be for the children. I mean, I think one of Brian's earlier points about head teachers being rightly criticised for having any sort of surplus. I mean, that's the absolute crux of it. I mean, where is the motivation or innovation there for a head teacher to say, actually, I've worked out how to do something for half the price, twice as well, you know, when they're criticised at the end of the day for having a surplus. You know, I mean, I think if we can't get past that, then it's going to be quite difficult. On Daniel's point, I mean, I think what you outlined there was a great kind of précis for an additional report, if any of us could face it. You know, it's certainly, there's a lot of work there around structures. Would they be federated? Would they run as chains? Would they partner up with other sectors as well? In terms of the monitoring, I mean, what the report, and I think you said that you were a third of the way through it, towards the end, it recommends something similar to the Monitor organisation, which is proposed in health, which would actually have quite a robust role to play in CERN in terms of financial viability, because we can't have schools, we can't have them failing essentially.
Gabriel, I'm interested in this ideological point and the difference, because it's my understanding that in Sweden there's pretty much consensus amongst both sides of Parliament that for-profit is acceptable. How has that come about in Sweden, and why is it not happening here?
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, I would say. It is definitely the case that the free school reform enjoys vast support from the population and from the parties. Now, the politics are still a bit contentious, but nobody is really proposing, apart from the former communists, to completely abolish it, rather than set in a better incentive framework, but also accountability framework that doesn't really exist. I just mentioned in my speech up there the decentralized grading practice that has to go. It's just we're basically the only country in the world that uses that. But I'm saying why it came about. I think also, I mean, these reforms were begun. The localization reforms were begun on the Social Democrats, and when everybody saw how popular they were very difficult to reverse. And there's a reason also, I would say, that why the for-profit companies didn't really come in until around 95, 96. And that was because there was very much political uncertainty whether or not the Social Democrats, who came back in power in 94, whether or not they would reverse the reform. They couldn't reverse the reform because it was so popular among the public.
Okay, thank you. I've time for one more round of questions, and then we'll wrap it up. So, lady at the back, gentleman here, and then this gentleman.
My name is Leila Moran. I'm a physics teacher. I started off my career in the States sector, but now I work in the international school sector, which is interesting because it's got a combination of profit and not-for-profit schools. I have to say there is a big difference in how schools are governed and how that filters into the classroom. And the suggestion that you can have for-profit companies in charge of schools and that not filter at all into the classroom, it's ununderstandable to me. I don't know how you can suggest that a for-profit company which is obsessed with numbers, and obsessed with outcomes, and numbers that they can then explain to their shareholders, that does influence how I am expected to teach in my classroom. And so my question to the panel is, if you did go along this route and you suggested that these for-profit companies were involved in education, how would you stop that? Because I would argue strongly, from my personal experience, it's not good for student quality outcomes.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Is it on? Alistair Graham. I've had 30 years of headship running an independent school, a family-owned prep school. I think the politicians have been a little disingenuous. I mean, the independent sector, although very small, it is world-class. And the results that our sector is producing is really way, way ahead of the state sector. And some time ago, Lord Adonis came to us and said, "We want your DNA," which was a bit spooky. But I think what we were happy to share with them was that the thing that really is special about an independent school is the parental involvement. And I think this is something that hasn't really been mentioned at all in this debate. We've been talking a lot about the children and outcomes. But if you can get the parents to buy into the system, there's no more powerful way than writing a cheque 3 times a year. The unfortunate thing about our system is that because of the educational trusts, it isn't really a proper free market solution. And you find that the costs are far too high, and therefore not enough parents can afford it. I would like us to be looking at the Australian model, where a direct grant is given to each independent school. And it's only a proportion of what the state would pay, but all of a sudden, you've got an ability to lower costs completely. Now, one other very quick point I'd like to make, we confuse schooling with education. A number of the panelists have said it's the job of the school to prepare children for life. It's the job of parents to prepare the children for life. Schools should school the children. The educational side, I believe, can go outside schools, in the private sector. So if a white working class boy wants to spend all afternoon on the football field, or boxing, or playing golf, whatever it might be, playing music, that's down to the parental choice, that's down to the child's choice, and the parents should be encouraged to make use of the private sector, perhaps by way of vouchers, so that that's possible.
Thank you. Final question, gentlemen here, front row.
Carl Allen, I'm just a dad, so I'm at your question. I'm not really concerned about profit maximization as how it might affect profit-making schools. What I am concerned about is that I've never once heard any of the potential profit makers say that where is school fails to deliver, profit-making schools fail to deliver, they will not only suffer a situation of no profit, but they will actually make a loss because they have to do remedial work, because children, in effect, are damaged. So once you say profit, I say in my mind, the consumer has rights, and they also have redress, and the question of compensation also arises.
Thank you. Graham, do you want to take on maybe this point about the independent sector on the...
Well, I should declare an interest as my children go to an independent sector school. The OECD, interestingly, when they, PISA, I didn't study the methodology, but they actually give the English independent sector -7. When they control for the social class background and natural parental involvement of people who write large checks. We're not talking about people writing checks. So one of the issues around for profit is, can you create a market when there's no, I mean, parents have vouchers, which is an entirely different question, then value for money comes in, and if the private sector can deliver the required quality that parents are prepared to accept at a lower cost and the money comes back to them, you're starting to get a market. But when that doesn't happen, and there isn't even a commissioning, or independent commissioning as a bit in health, so at least there's competition again on price. It's no price competition. Is it a market? In which case, how do they make profit? Well, if they do that simply by using the flexibilities and paying conditions, so that overall they pay teachers less, and we think the central challenge is to get better, higher quality people into teaching, then we are not raising. I'm not saying that's the only side of the argument, but it's what we're going to do is have better quality teachers. And what the independent sector is particularly good at is getting all the best teachers. If you look at the percentage of people with PhDs in teaching who teach in the independent sector, it's massive. Those with masters, massive. Those with the best degrees from the best universities, massive. So the independent sector has got an awful lot of the best people in the profession and are able to use the checkbooks of the parents in order to deliver it, which is not to say, I think they are world class, but certainly the OECD and PISA, probably the global experts in it, the sector didn't come out as quite as brilliantly as you might think. So I don't think I'm considered generous. I could, if I were rude, accuse you of the same.
Gabriel, the first question and the third question are quite direct challenges to private companies, aren't they, in terms of can you actually prevent the private companies almost contaminating the classroom if they're investing in it? And the third question around, would the private company be prepared to actually reinvest in the school if the kids were behind? Those are quite big challenges for the private sector to take on.
Yeah, well, when it comes to reinvestments, the evidence from Sweden suggests that they do. They tend to reinvest, and that it apparently works. It works over there. And sorry, the first question was, I didn't really get
the first question just around this the idea that if you have shareholders in a school, that the teacher in the classroom is going to be impacted by that in a way that they wouldn't be if that wasn't the case.
Well, certainly you always have it, but the question is, would those shareholders have an investment stake in how can we increase the value of the school? Is that by increasing quality? Well, then it's just good that the teacher is influenced by it. It's perfect. And I would say, this incentive framework we've been talking about, there is strong evidence out there that teacher, performance-related pay works, but nobody wants to touch it because it's political. There's evidence that autonomy works. Like, as I said, you can't just allow for-profit companies to say, hey, you can do this, but you can't pay your teacher this, and you can't mix, try out and experiment with different things. That's not going to do anything in that case. So, on the first question, there is evidence that they do reinvest in the schools. There are plenty of companies being in.
Sorry, my question was not about the investment. I see that in a number of literature.
Okay.
My question is, I've never seen or heard of any example where a school will actually do remedial work when they fail students, which could possibly mean 2 or 3 extra years schooling for that student. Remedial work is expensive.
Remedial.
So if the child leaves the school without exams that resulted in a certain standard, that they would almost be required, the company would pay for the moments to stay on at the school and get them up to scratch.
Yeah, well, I mean, if the requirements in that aspect are the same for the corporate schools, there would be no difference. I don't see why the ownership structure here would make any difference in this case.
Yeah. Brian, do you want to just...
I wanted to just correct 2 things that Gabriel just said there. Firstly, we do have performance-related pay in schools, the systems around it have been reviewed and are changing. But we have that there. But we also have enormous pay flexibilities within the schools as well, and to suggest that we have an inflexible pay framework is actually incorrect. The National Framework of Pay and Conditions for Teachers actually has a lot of flexibility in it, and beyond that, of course, the academies can go beyond that anyway. So I don't think those two issues. And the other point I'll just quickly come in on is, I think the key question here about parents and the involvement of buying into the independent sector and those 2 questions that came in there are that the real challenge, the biggest challenge for us as leaders of schools is not the parents who buy in and who are committed to the children's education and all the rest of it. It's the parents who will not buy in and who will not show any of that commitment or support. And I'm afraid there are quite a significant number of those, and we have to compensate for that. And that's not a profitable business, as the gentleman at the front has said there. That is an issue where we have to invest, and we have to use our resources and things like the pupil premium that we really welcome, all those sorts of things, so that we are able, and when you look at some of the schools that have overcome the biggest barriers facing them, some of the London schools that have really gone up in their performance, they have done it precisely by intervening and supporting those children who don't have that benefit of a background at home that gives them that a good start.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you all very much for coming. Please join me in thanking our panel speakers.